I can hear you. Yeah. There you go.
So shall we start? Yeah. Questions? We have a question in the audience here. Can I take that first?
Yeah, that was my plan, was you would take the questions there first.
Yes, Kanuram.
You mentioned the other day, we were talking about Krishna in the Rasa-lila dance, dancing with each gopi. And the question was asked, so does each gopi know that Krishna is also dancing with the other gopis? And your response was that they don't know that because it would lend to that their feeling of aisvarya might be increased if they were to know that he's like a powerful mystic or a god that is acting through him or something like that. So my question is, it seems like there may be some instances where Krishna does something profound and it does not increase the feelings of aisvarya in his followers and friends and Ingalo. So are the gopis, seems like their mood wouldn't be affected by feelings of aisvarya in response to such a thing.
Right, typically that's true, that the measure of the frame in Braj, comparatively, let's say comparative to, comparable to Mathura or Dwarka, where aisvarya is more prominent, the measure of the prema in Braj is such that even if Krishna shows some aisvarya, for example, lifting the Govardhan hill, quite a measure of majesty and opulence, it doesn't affect their prema and cause it to shrink. Whereas if you go, for example, to Bhagavad Gita, when Arjuna was shown the universal form, the virata-rupa, then his sakhya-bhava, it receded and was overtaken by the majestic display of Krishna, which he felt uncomfortable with. But in Braj, that doesn't happen. But I think what I meant by that was more that, well, each gopi is allowed to think that Krishna is with me only. She may find out that every gopi felt like that. They all exchanged that, but at least one at a time, something like that. And I think that it's an instance in which knowledge of his Vaishvarya, that he's doing something supernatural, extraordinary, would not have enhanced the occasion in ways, would not have enhanced the situation. There are other aspects of it that are elements of aisvarya, in a sense. The devas are showering flowers and flying in airplanes and washing, and they are aware of that, and they take that in a particular way. But we find instances also in Satyaras where Krishna expands himself to be with all of his friends at the same time. A bed for is made of flowers for him, and he uses each one of them as a pillow of his friends. And I just, if you could just think about it for a minute, it kind of takes away from the whole affair if that one's aware of that. So it's a little bit of a different way in which we would say that Aishvarya, the Aishvarya Shakti of Krishna is functioning for a particular purpose, that it's not in the interest of everyone to be aware of what she's doing. She sees an opportunity Aishvarya Shakti to play a role in the Madhurya Lila, which is characteristically, in one sense, not predominated by Aishvarya, even while in another sense, as I've said before, the real Aishvarya is the intimacy. The intimacy is the most extraordinary display of his godhood that you could possibly come up with. Bhagavad Gita says that each of the Brajavasis has a sign, has a like something Aishvarya written on the back of their heads, printed there. But no one can read it, so love is blind and ignorance is bliss. It's his way of his saying this is the ultimate Aishvarya itself. It exceeds even the extraordinary Aishvarya of Krishna's Brahma Vimohan Lila, which he showed to Brahma, which is overtly such. But if you look more deeply, the fact that God is doing this, intimately associating as such with his devotees, is the most extraordinary aspect of the Godhead, which far exceeds any overt display of majesty. So Vrindavan is the most, there you'll find the most Aishvarya, the fullest expression. And these two, Aishvarya and Madhurya, the majesty and the intimacy of the Leela are interpenetrating, really, one another. Rajalila, Vijay. Nice thought. Huh? Yes.
And would they think that, oh, this is just the doings of Narayan, or Narayan is?
Well, it would be difficult to think that in those circumstances. I think it's just hidden from how altogether for the sake of affording gopis, in this case, the experience. They see Krishna, they see that the dance begins. He's dancing with all of them, one after another. But then to each of them it appears, now he's exclusively with me. They may, now he's with her. They may experience that as well. Yes.
Kind of came to think of, I was reading Gita this morning, and I think it's 11:35 in the verse, when Arjuna is just starting to address Krishna after seeing the virata-rupa. It said that Gadgada, the word Gadgada, he kind of goes into this anubhav. So he just was wondering, how is that in relation with his sort of sakhya mode, which is diminished by the aisvarya? So is there any, how to understand that? Does that make sense?
What you're saying is that he was choked up.
Yeah, but then I think your comment there that is his bhav coming out. But if it's diminished by that aishwarya of seeing that kind of that fearful aspect.
Well, I think that the nature of Arjuna's bhav is such that it responds in a particular way to the aishvarya. So it's not that he loses his bhav altogether, but the nature of his sakhya rasa is that it will be affected in such circumstances. It doesn't mean that he won't have ecstatic symptoms and so forth. So to make the case further a little bit, it's not that ecstatic symptoms like the voice choking up is only relevant to intimacy in love of God. That can also take place in relation to, in a setting where the devotees have love for Krishna with Aishvarya Bhav. So there are sattvic bhavs for that will manifest in Vaikuntha also.
Okay.
You understand? Another question? Or from the Zoom?
I've got one. Can you hear me okay?
I can.
Okay. So Yugal Kishore has a question.
Hello.
Hello.
Hey, Swami. Sorry
What's going
I
on?
couldn't make it there this weekend, but it's good to be on the phone call with you guys.
Yeah, it's good to have you.
I ended up having to work. I actually have to go into work in a little bit. But okay. So I believe I told you last time I had like so many questions. I'm trying to really maximize everybody's time. So maybe I'll ask this. In your own sadhana over the years, I mean, you've been a monk for over 50 years, which is extraordinary. I think mind-blowing for most people. What has the rule of doubt been in your own practice?
The rule of doubt?
The role of doubt been in your own practice? Like, how has that factored into your development of faith and, you know, trusting the process and kind of looking at these epistemological hierarchies, as Swami Padmanabha calls them, of like gurus, shastra, sangha, these sort of things. How does that doubt factor into that process?
Well, I would say that my first experience of doubts arose in the context of sharing my faith in the streets with persons, context of distributing Prabhupada's books in parking lots in Los Angeles and such. And they would arise when I would try to explain some philosophical point in the context of trying to encourage someone to purchase the book, and then they would have a response. And if I couldn't respond, I would always have a response, but my response was not always to my satisfaction. So then I would be possessed to come back and find a better answer, always. And I had two ways of doing that. One would be to look into the books that we had, which were limited while unlimited at the same time. I mean, the books were coming out gradually, and there's so many more books now, even by different authors, and I myself am an author, and so forth and so on. So the extent to which Gaudiya Siddhanta is out and about now, well, it's evidenced by the kind of questions we get and so forth. I mean, these questions have never been asked in 1972. I think, so that's just a result of, just another point comes to my mind. I used to think, well, because we had this kind of idea we were going to take over the world, just by selling Prabhupada's books. And I used to think, well, if we did, if America, the United States became, was converted to Hinduism at least, or something like that, well, even Gaudiya Vaishnavism, I thought there would still be so much like problems and confusion, questions to be answered, and so on and so forth. I like the challenge. Not that will never end. It's just going to be on another level. And so, but then we find that as it grows and more knowledge about the tradition, its history, its philosophy, its theology is circulated and so forth, and people are taking birth in the mission who were in the mission previously and so forth. So you get people whose level of participation and so forth fosters deeper questions and so on. But at any rate, at the time we had, in the beginning we had, for example, little chapters published of the Bhagavatam. Prabhupada was translating the Bhagavatam, and when I joined the earlier edited by Macmillan publishing house edition of Prabhupada's Gita was available. It was fairly heavily edited. They took out a lot of it to make it what they thought was more marketable. And so there was work going on to bring out the unedited edition, which would be published by his own book trust, which was, had now been formed and so forth. We had the teachings of Lord Chaitanya, which perhaps was the only book that he wrote, because all the other books were comments on other books and so forth. And then we had, I think we might have had the Nectar Devotion too, I'm not sure. And then there were little books like Easy Journey to Other Planets and was it a Topmost Yoga?
Sri Upanishad.
Sri Upanishad, yeah. The Krishna books came out shortly, a little trilogy and so forth. So, so anyway, I would, that's what I would do. My life consisted of rising, waking, attending the programs, chanting, going through the class, taking prasadam. If my rounds weren't finished, which is how it was originally, then I would go and stand before the deities in Los Angeles and chant till they were finished. And then, because I didn't know what to do with myself, I didn't have an education or any expertise, and I felt all the devotees were much more talented than myself. I like to talk about Krishna, so I'd catch a bus and go to Hollywood Boulevard and a pair of cartels, and I would chant for 20 minutes, and then I would distribute books for an hour, then I would chant for 20 minutes, and so forth. When eventually the guy who drove the bus, when he dropped me off or when I'd get on the bus, he knew he should make an announcement. Oh, listen to this guy now. They all pay attention to him. You know what he's talking about. So I'm rather introverted in a lot of ways, but when it comes to speaking about Krishna, I'm not too shy. So, at any rate, I would go back and I would read. This is one of the ways of resolving the doubts, if you will, and the other way is that I would go and chant before the deities and just let them know that I got to get a better answer for this guy. The next person would ask that question, and invariably I would get the answers, and I feel that were satisfactory, and so forth and so on. But so that was my beginning of experience of doubts, how they would come. One time, just remembering those early days in Los Angeles, I actually joined in Santa Cruz Mountains. Well, I wouldn't go into that, but I had gone. Stories go. Anyway, they found me. The devotees who had a traveling Sankirtan party, they found me in Santa Cruz Mountains with a shaved head and an orange robe, chanting and teaching from the Krishna book. I didn't know how to join, but I had come in touch with these things and adapted the attire and so forth. So you can't do it like that. I was married, so you can't wear that color. Okay, however you want to do it. So then I moved down to Santa Cruz, where they had a preaching center, and there I would go out and Harinam, and also sell back to Godhead magazines. And then Prabhupada came to Los Angeles several months later, so they took me down there to meet Prabhupada, and Prabhupada told me to stay there. And my wife was pregnant, so they gave us a little apartment across from the temple. And then I would, as I said, we go out on book distribution. So at any rate, during that period, a doubt arose in my mind. It was very disturbing. And that was a fellow, I think his name was Mahapurush. He said to me one day, he had joined earlier than me, so there was a big thing about that. He had joined 6 months earlier. He was a senior. So he said to me, not everybody goes to Goloka. Most of the devotees go to Vaikuntha. And that just really disturbed my mind. I thought, how could that possibly be the case? I would chant before Rukmini and Dwarkadesh. It was one of the biggest. It wasn't a doubt. It was a doubt that he had caused by what he said that I couldn't agree with, but I know I didn't have the answer to it. Now you know so much, any of you could answer it, I suppose, but then we were a little limited, and Prabhupada was bringing it out as fast as he could, and faster than we could publish what he was writing and so forth. But the deities resolved it for me, thankfully. So that was my initial experience with doubts and how to deal with them. And as time went on, nothing changed really. But another kind of era, if you will, of doubts that arose was when I came in touch with. We lived in a little bit of a cocoon, so to speak, or with Prabhupada, just Prabhupada and us and the world, and we were relatively unaware of Gaudiya Vaishnavism at large. We didn't have much of any experience of it. We had a little bit in that Prabhupada, while he was writing his books, you don't mind me going on about this. This is long here. But he's writing his books. He had also books from Gaudiya Math that had been published. The focus of Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur was mostly not his own books, but the books of Bhakti Vinod. There were a couple of things that he had written too. Prabhupada had them shipped to America, which at that time his capital was in Los Angeles. And so on Sundays, I would man the book table and with all these Gaudiya Math books that we had, and some, limited what books of Prabhupada that we had. So, like I read, Jaiva Dharma in what I call Benglish, half Bengali and half English, but because it was in English, but in 1973, dealing with issues in the text. And harmonizing them in the way in which Bhaktivinoda talked about certain things and Prabhupada perhaps differently. But that difference, if you will, became more prominent in my experience after Prabhupada left, and to fill the vacuum, if you will, that his own disciples, I would say, fell short of filling. By the arrangement of Krishna, other persons came to the surface, and a prominent one of which, of course, was one whom Prabhupada opened the door to, Pujapad Bhakti-Rakta Sri Radharani Goswami Maharaj. And there at his mata I met Prabhupada Puri Goswami Maharaj, and also became somewhat prominent to Prabhupada and so forth. And others, they were like, uncles. Bhakti Maharaj was like an older cousin, him being a disciple of one of Prabhupada's godbrothers, came in touch with him after Sri Maharaj left and so forth. So these persons were coming onto the scene, and they were speaking about Gaudiya Vaishnavism. And the larger world, if you will, of Gaudiya Vaishnavism became more apparent to me. And some of in the context of that, some of the arguments against Gaudiya Math, against Bhaktisiddhanta, who was a very powerful preacher and disturbed a lot of people, which is what preaching tends to do. It tends to unsettle people, make them rethink, and so on. It's not just a pat on the back, if you will. I was any arguments. I was up for the challenge, and the very to add to this, a handful of my godbrothers had left Prabhupada's mission. Jai Satyanandan, Itai, Garbha, his name then, Pandu, Dear Krishna, no. He joined Sri Radharani. But they left the Bhakti Vinod Parivar. And so they had been exposed to arguments against the validity of our parampara. And in response to them, they left our parampara and then joined and became reinitiated in other paribars. And if you, the arguments that fostered that they caved to, if you will, if I was to lay them out to you now, those of you who've heard me for years, you'd probably find them fairly silly. I mean, but there was a very, in Gaudiya Vaishnavism, you have, since the time of the founding acharyas, you have some renunciates, really extraordinary people. And then you had largely the Goswamis, who were like adopted the name, as far as I understand, the Goswami, even though they were family people, to show their identification with Rupa and Sanatan, having been initiated by, well, it would have been by Jiva Goswami, who was Rupa Sanatan. They didn't initiate widely. Rupa Sanatan initiated Jiva Goswami, but Gopal Bhatta Goswami had a number of disciples and so forth. So I think they, as far as I can tell, they changed their name to Goswami, and they were householders. It's kind of weird to think, well, a householder is not a Goswami, but another way, it's kind of charming. But at any rate, these were religious men from Brahmin families, and by caste, if you will, within Varnashram, the Brahmins would be the religious teachers and the priests. And so when you take that and bring that into Gaudiya Vaishnavism, well, they became, because they were not Brahmins only, but they were Gaudiya Vaishnavas, they became the kind of default, largely gurus. And they, unlike the Gorkishore Das Babajis or the Vamsi Das Babajis, were, plentiful in comparison. And they focused a little bit more on making like a systematic approach and formalizing, how things what would be the aspects of initiation. You had to get a letter to identify that you were actually a member of this party bar, and you have to wear this color, or you'd have to have your tilak like this. All these things came from this. They're nice, they're meaningful, they're beautiful. Each party bar has its own tilak, a little different than the other one, and because they're coming from Nityanand or Advaita, then that will have some factor in where particularly they're going to end up in Goloka, under which groups of manjaris and so forth. It's a nice thing, but it's somewhat relative, and lots and lots and lots of details that are subject to change and so forth. You take what Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur was trying to do, put the mission of Bhakti Vinod, the idea, the spirit of Bhakti Vinod in place, but he had to make all kinds of adjustments. And, they would say, well, here, it says right here that Gaudiya Vaishnava should wear a white cloth. You're wearing saffron. Your guru's wearing saffron. It's kind of silly to think that the color, King Kori Baba wore a burlap bag. So, but the arguments at the time were pressing to these devotees. There's lots of them. Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur, after he left, then people came out of the woodwork to criticize his mission, which was weakened by the same thing that Prophet Iskon was weakened by, an inability to some extent of his disciples to fill the vacuum. Over time, of course, they did that. Pujapad Sridhar Maharaj, Bhakti Prabhupada Keshav Maharaj, my Guru Maharaj, and so forth. But it took years for that to come about, and it came about independent of the official mission. So that means it takes time to build up. Gaudiya Math was a powerful institution, but when you have differences from someone who is presenting themselves as the real heir apparent, and for good reason, then you have to go separately. Well, they started their missions, and it took time for them to have the kind of credibility in numbers and books and temples and so forth, that they were really an institution. I don't have to worry about that. I got some books. So, so, over time, let's like take Prabhupada, for example. Prabhupada, he came to America in 1965 or something like that. That's a long time, 30 years after Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur disappeared, and then took him a few years to establish ISKCON and so forth. Meanwhile, during that period, it took some of his godbrothers years to get 12 temples in India where they were preaching what's his name? Well, they were preaching in different parts. Maybe in one of the Prophet's godbrothers. They had fairly robust missions, a number of them. Sridhar Maharaj wasn't so much his nature. He had him off in Navadvip and was very introverted comparatively, but some of them had pretty robust missions in India and so forth. They didn't compare to what Prabhupada would establish worldwide and so forth. But anyway, the point is this took a little bit of time. So a vacuum was created with regard to succession and who will fill the shoes of Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur. We find that in ISKCON also. And so people like me came out, and Sridhar Maharaj came to fill the gap, relatively speaking, or absolutely speaking, but to a limited extent. He told me, Swami Maharaj Prabhupada told you everything, you know everything. Go and do something for me. Start a mission yourself. And if you have any questions, I will be in the background and so forth. So anyway, at that time, I became more exposed to other arguments about our paramparas. So I was very keen on finding the answers. Govinda Maharaj, the successor of Puchpachita Maharaj, once said that Tripurari Maharaj has deep Guru Nishta to go after that issue. We're going to chant, go ahead, research all of that, because other people had researched it and succumbed, to the points that were being raised in criticism and left the party bar and so forth. Now, I got into it quite a bit, and I thought the arguments were a little more challenging at the time, but I needed to satisfy my own, doubting function, my own intellect, and respond. I wrote a short booklet some years ago called Sri Guru Parampara, the subtitle, I forget what it was, the Kedarnath, the heir of Kedarnath, Thakur Bhakti Bhakti-siddhanta, and the difference between him and his brother, the late Prasad, who was critical of Bhakti-siddhanta and his mission, in which some of my godbrothers had gone to him and left ISKCON, a few of them. None of them fared that well. That's another thing. Over time, they thought they were going to step into Manjari bodies momentarily. Didn't happen like that. But my experience was always very deep. So I was grounded in experience, and I supported my experience with my philosophical penchant, acumen, and so forth. So my doubts might be different than yours, Yoga Kishore, on a different level. That's who I am and how I dealt with them. I was always up for the challenge, if you will, and well, what about now? In modern times, then I also had to deal, given my nature as I'm explaining it, with arguments from the modern philosophical and scientific world that were substantial in terms of a response to simple arguments that Prabhupada would give as to the difference between consciousness and matter. Prabhupada would say things like, we don't say I body, we say my body. Therefore, I must not be my body. That was enough. Wow. Like this, we're not that body was like a mantra or something. It's like a koan. It's like, what's that? And you could say it to somebody and they would just go, no, you're not that body. I mean, so it was quite kind of a startling statement, and it was very motivating also. And it's kind of the basis, right, of Vedanta philosophy, just the basis. It's like 101. It's so 101, if you will, that Rupa Goswami says knowledge of the difference between the Atma and the body is not an anga of bhakti. It just like happens when you do angas of bhakti, that you realize that. Whereas it's the whole argument, in Advaita Vedanta practically, that once you figure that out and you're done. That's not where we're not done with that. We got a lot more to go from there to attain prema and so forth. So, but in Prabhupada's time, it was important, to emphasize that, and given the audience that he had and so on and so forth, right? So it was a strong argument, but a strong point. And there were many simple common sense kind of arguments that he would give and so on and so forth. But they weren't responses that you could give today to someone who was educated in, for example, the mind-brain argument, which is a conundrum. Is the mind a brain, or is the mind different from the brain? If it is, where is it? Why can't we see it? How does it? In the history of science, it was thought under the Newtonian physical perspective that really we knew the forces that caused everything in the world. There would be strong and weak nuclear forces, gravitational force, electromagnetic force, and that's it. So the idea that consciousness and the will of an individual even existed, so to speak, if it did, had any influence on what happens in the world, just was not, something to entertain. And then with the development of the quantum physical perspective, well, that changed a bit. Now the observer influences the what happens. Now, whether that sophisticated arguments, whether that observer has to be a being or not, they argue against that. I think there's a good argument for it. Needs to be and so forth. But they're very sophisticated arguments, very heady, and you have to know the terminology and whatnot that they use, enter in there, and you got to know something about physics, which is, and biology, Prabhupada's comments about Darwinian philosophy. Well, they were fine for us at the time, but the argument of Darwinian philosophy has become much more sophisticated over the last, half of a century than it was in 1960 and so forth. So because in my trajectory, if you will, I was a member of ISKCON, and I left ISKCON by force of circumstance because I felt I could better serve Prabhupada serving independently. And of course, I had guidance of Sridhar Maharaj from the Siksha Guru. And he told me to do something separately, a mission. And when you do that, well, you don't have this whole big mission behind you. You've got to create a world, for yourself to talk to. You got to see what the arguments out there are, and so on and so forth. And I was very at that time. After leaving ISKCON, I was very disappointed to find that while I was in a mission that was very convinced about its philosophical perspective, it was not the arguments that it entertained, basically, and embraced, were not arguments that would be brought up in a social gathering amongst educated people, where you might find, where have you been lately? I haven't seen you in so long. Well, I took a month and I went to a Buddhist retreat, and it would be cool. Wow. Would you like some wine? Tell me about it, But if you said, well, I was, I joined the Hare Krishnas for a month. Well, it's nice, haven't seen you in a while. Oh, but I haven't seen you for a while. Longer, kind of. It wasn't, I'm over kind of emphasizing, exaggerating, but it was not our theology, our philosophy was not something that was being entertained by educated people many of whom were affected and to some extent by the mission, unknowingly, if you will, Prabhupada's influence and others from the East, they were being influenced by Eastern, philosophy, which is subtle in its influence. So the way in which Eastern philosophy has creeped into, Western sensibilities, which were theologically speaking almost universally Christian at one point, is considerable, but it's subtle. If you look at art, you can find it. You know what you're looking for. If we look at a dictionary, karma, dharma, it's on a TV show. I mean, whether the concepts are understood or to what extent, who knows? Concepts of reincarnation. A lot of these computer people are into it. They name their program Shiva or something. It's out there. So the influence of Eastern philosophy is actually considerable in the Western world. In the Western Eurocentric, perspective is affected by it in ways that they don't. It's not always acknowledged or not that well understood, I don't think. And just the nature of Eastern way of expressing itself is more gentle and inclusive and subtle. So anyway, I felt disappointed that Gaudiya Vaishnavism, being as rich philosophically and theologically as it is, was not understood by such people and being talked about in comparison, for example, to Buddhism or Advaita Vedanta, which are just like very very much lacking the charm and the philosophical, theological nuance of Gaudiya Vaishnavism. I mean, there's just no comparison. I used to think if we could get the Western world to acknowledge that consciousness is a fundamental feature of the world, right? And it has an ontological status. It's not something that it's irreducible. That, of course, where they would be most susceptible then to gravitate toward would be Advaita Vedanta, Neo-Advaita perspective, where all the religious baggage is left behind. If you look at Shankar, he didn't really leave any religious baggage behind, which would include, in the modern thinking, all the stuff about Krishna, this mythological. I mean, for Shankar, Krishna was as real as he is in this world, and his Prakat Lila was as he was for any Vaishnava. He has this 2 tiers of Brahman, right? He has the Nirguna Brahman and the Saguna Brahman. The Saguna Brahman is not just some mythological story, it's a reality. Ishwar comes to the world. Shankar said, if I could only retire on the banks of the Jamuna and just hear Krishna's pastimes, my life would be complete. There are verses like this from Shankar's own pen and so forth. So the Neo-Advaitins, they want to do away with all this baggage. And this is kind of a conformity, if you will, to the modern philosophical materialistic perspective. That's why they gravitate towards Buddhism. It's not theological per se, and it's all about logic, reason, and we can do away with certain aspects that they want to do away with reincarnation and karma because they just can't support it with their reason based on particular interpretations of scientific data that's been then philosophized about, that's so built in to the society that the economy is dependent upon it. Academia, to be anywhere in that field of education, is dependent on largely buying into this physicalism, naturalism, materialism as a philosophy, and so forth. So if we could get them to, and it is moving in that direction, towards a panpsychic perspective. Panpsychism means Christian's consciousness is everywhere. And it's an ontological substance. And 10 years ago, panpsychism, if you were a panpsychist, you were a nut. You thought that bees had egos, you know, but now they find they do. The trees talk to one another. It's magical thinking. I'll tell you what's magical. The idea that at some point, non-experiential content, matter, suddenly becomes experiential. Like I said, the billiard ball suddenly says, could you put a little chalk on the end of that thing? That's physicalism. It accounts for consciousness in this way, that it arises. One of the perspectives would be like, you know, what do they call it? Like steam, epiphenomenal. That you know, there's many perspectives on it. That's why. So it's there, but it doesn't have any. You know, what does it do? You know, steam coming off of a teapot. It's there, but it doesn't have any effect back on the system, on the pot, or whatever. Anyway, I thought, well, if they could, and it is going in this direction. They have, of course, materialistic perspectives of panpsychism. They keep trying to stay in the predominant paradigm because you'll be thought to be weird, stupid, sentimental, not rational. Meanwhile, of course, physicalism or materialism says that reason has no more meaning than, you know, the sound of rain falling on your roof. So it doesn't do, you know, you really, theism gives much more room for reason to have a role, to be meaningful. But anyway, it's silly the way really closely at it, but it's a bit, this is the predominant paradigm, materialism. So if you think as probably changing the world, he wanted to preach to educated people. When I started to find out what educated people really thought, rather than somebody I met at the Kmart, you know, take a book or something, whatever, to get into their arguments. And I had more time to do it because this country is very busy in a certain way, largely at the time in Eastern Europe, which had opened up, you know, in the 80s. And so there was lots of people to join who were just like eager for something else besides communism, you know. And so they weren't, I don't mean to diminish them at all, but they weren't the kind of thinking audience that I'm you know, talking about. Easy converts and so forth. Hippies were easy converts. Punks were easy converts. But and that's all good. But to get this Gaudiya Vaishnavism into where it would be fashionable to speak about it in social circle and be entertained for its intellectual integrity. Any philosophy is only going to have so much intellectual integrity to it, where you can say, okay, at least it's rationally, you know, you can be rational and have this philosophy. It won't answer every question. It will for you, but it won't for everybody. We're talking, of course, ultimately about something that doesn't answer to reason, and where it's beyond reason, it's beyond thought, it's beyond words. So thought through reason, we can only say so much about it and try to put it into words. So you can always find a little hope. What about that? You know, how's that work? And you just go, well, that's, you know, the part we couldn't explain yet. You have to go there. And probably say, go there and find out. People probably would say, why don't you go there and find out? So anyway, that's been my concern for some time. And I thought if we could get the world to embrace a panpsychic perspective, the original form of which is Vedanta, then they would naturally gravitate towards an Advaita Vedanta, a neo-Advaita perspective. And I thought that would be good, as much as Prabhupada would lambast against the Mayavadis. You know, this is a different time and a different circumstance. So we'll all get there, and then we can talk about, you know, what is consciousness. Everybody's accepting that it's beyond time and space, and it's for example, then we have some very nice comments, you know, to bring in to consider. So that there's a lot of like really head-bending kind of thoughts, and you, Kishore, you're a little aware of that field. I think we studied a little bit of that, right? We used to talk about it sometimes. So I had to I had to come up with all the sufficient response to it. And I'm quite comfortable with what I was able to come up with and answer those type of doubts that arose from that particular audience. So this is a little bit of my history dealing with doubts. So stick with me. I'm faithful.
Thank you, Maharaj, for sharing.
I took a long time to answer that one. Some good ground to cover. What's the time now?
12:30.
Any other, sorry, if other questions?
No, it's fine. Are you checking for questions there? There's a few questions on here on Zoom.
Well, should we take a couple more?
Yeah.
Shortly, try to give short answer to what have we got?
Okay, so Abai said, my question is from Hari, Leela, and my reading of Madhurya Kadambini. In the section about offenses, it mentions that up to this stage of bhava, you can make an offense. And it says that the result of offenses on the stage of bhava can be to have your rasa lowered from an example gopi bhav to sakhya-bhava. I was a bit unsure of how to think about this, as all of the rasas are just different degrees of perfection. And I certainly didn't like to think of someone becoming a cowherd boy as a punishment for an offense. So just wondering if you could speak about this a little. Thanks so much.
Yeah, it is a confusing statement about the Rasa-lila Sindhu, I have to admit. There it said that if one offends a devotee to one degree or another, I think he cites maybe the commentators, 3 different degrees, there will be 3 different results. Even if one is in bhava, one's bhava could be turned to a shadow of bhava only, or downgraded, as you're referring to, or done away with, or something like that, I think. If the offense is more serious and so on. The examples that are cited by Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur are really not very good examples in a sense, because they deal with examples of persons who are in the Lila and are liberated and so on. So I like to think of it more as a hypothetical, if you will. The chance of someone making an offense to a Vaishnava in Bhava Bhakti is like, well, you could say it's there, because he hasn't or she hasn't attained praying, but the likelihood of it happening is just it's something you could say about it if it happened, but it won't happen, something like that. Yes.
Could it also be like evidence of non-inherency?
Well, people argue both ways on that, but yeah, you could make an argument like that. And there also, I would say that there are 2 stages of bhava. There's the sprout of bhava, bhava ankur, and then there's the full development of bhava, which we refer to as like swarup siddhi. So in the earlier stages, something like that may be more possible. Another way, I should say, in which Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur has talked about it in his commentary on the Bhagavad in the 3rd canto, he speaks about the fact that the Kumaras approached the gates of Vaikuntha, and they offended the gatekeepers by their response. And they were Brahmavadis. Now they were in touch with devotees in Dasya Bhakti. They could have got Dasya Bhakti, but because they offended them, they could only get Shanta Bhakti. Of course, from Shanta Bhakti, you can change. We talked about that the other day in relation to the Kumaras, how they, through association, they change, whereas from Dasya Bhakti or Sakya, it's not going to change. But he spoke about that in that way. So anyway, as I say, I try to look at it as a hypothetical, and I think the verse doesn't speak about those differences, but the commentators have given that correct possibility. Lesser offense, this will happen. Greater offense, that will. So that's my short answer on that one. Another question?
There's another one here. Oh, is there another one there?
No.
Okay. So Sharada said, I read in the Bhagavatam 6th canto that Lakshmi, being the internal potency of the Lord, is the greatest worshiper of Lord Narayan. Can you compare her with Radharani in the context of how they worship the Supreme Personality of Godhead? Namaskar, Sharada.
Yes. Yes, of course, Lakshmi is considered to be an expansion of Radha. It's like Narayan is an expansion of Krishna in the Paralila. So Lakshmi is the Radha of Narayan. Something like that. Of course, and she's known for her chastity to Narayan, of course. Therefore, she was really questioned when she expressed a desire to enter the rasa dance with Krishna. Chaitanya Mahaprabhu said, how is it that this Lakshmi that's so chaste to Narayan wants to have an erotic fling with Krishna? He asked Venkatabhatta, who was the head priest for the Ramanuja Sampradaya. And Ramanuja said, oh, no, there's not a problem. He explained the tattva. He said, Narayan and Krishna, they're the same person. It's the same person. Mahaprabhu was pleased with the answer, and then he said, how come she couldn't? She wanted to have a date with Krishna under the moonlight in Braj, like the gopis, because she was getting a little tired of, her role with Narayana. She saw these gopis, they got a little more, something to say. They can make a point here and change the equation a little bit. Going to try that, But Mahaprabhu said, how come she couldn't? She couldn't answer the rasa. Then Venkatabhatta passed out at that point. He said, only someone who Ryan himself could ask that question. He would know the answer. And of course, Mahaprabhu gave the answer. To answer, Lakshmi has certain bhavs, so she can't change her bhav. And if you were to, there's a particular way to do that. You have to follow exactly in the footsteps of the gopis. Instead, what she did was she went to Braj, she sat down, she began eating roots and whatever fell from the trees and performing tapasya and austerities. And Krishna came across her and said, Lakshmi, what are you doing here? Where's your royal attire and everything? And you're eating, living like an ascetic. And she said, well, I want to enter the rasa dance. I said, well, it's not like that. It's so easy to do. You performing all these austerities and it's unbecoming for a lady of your stature. So you don't have to. It's not necessary. Our austerities are taught us things like wearing tilak, and our austerities are like observing modesty, things like that. So anyway, it's very simple. But all you have to do is you have to give up your husband. First of all, that's first. You have to marry another husband here in Braj, and then you have to give him up. She ran back to Vaikuntha after that. Her study about could not digest that at all. So for Parkiya. So something about Laxmidevi. All right, so I think we'll stop there. Nice to be with all of you on Zoom and everyone here. Gaur Premanande. Govinda ki jai. Panchakalpatarubhyascha Sindhu Vaishnava ki jai.
His Divine Grace Bhaktivedanta Tripurari Guru Maharaj Ki Jai.
Now.
I don't know. Subal, is it kirtan now? If you want to make a short kirtan,
Okay, that was nice.
Does he go back to California today, tomorrow?
I don't know. I know it's really, really soon though. My guess is in the next few days, if not tomorrow, because I know that there are no more classes.
Right.
Well, he's not giving any more classes. Yeah, I'm pretty bummed I couldn't go this weekend. Okay, so I'm gonna announce the classes. So this is the last week of March. So on Monday, Hari Priya is giving class, chanting as the prayer of the heart. And then on Tuesday, Guru Nishtha is giving class, Hari Nan Chintamani, how to chant Shuddha Nam. And then on Wednesdays, this last Wednesday, exploring the third verse of Shikshastakam with Guru Sundar. And then on Thursday, Brigupad is giving class, Sri Chaitanya's Holy Land, Navadweep Dham. And I think, Arjuna, do you know the answer to this? So Friday is April the 1st. Are we just continuing? Or does anyone know the answer if we're just continuing with the same classes? The last?
I'm not sure.
Yeah, we don't know. Well, Shamananda is giving one of the classes. I don't know if does anyone know? Who knows? Okay. So we'll just see. So Ashram Maharaj could give class or someone else on Friday. And then Shamananda could be giving class as the sun rises and sets. Gaudiya Vaishnavism goes west. Yeah, is there anything I'm forgetting, Archana?
I don't think so.
I don't think so either. All right.